What's up, guys? It's Josh of TheCardGuyz, and today we're going to be going over episode 11 of FAB 201. Today we're going to be talking about how to pick a tournament deck. In particular, we're going to be talking about this in the context of Pro Tour 2 in Lille. So we're going to be analyzing the current metagame. We're going to be looking at trends in the main board and in particular the sideboard, and just the general discourse and feelings about the state of the game. After we go over that, we're going to be I'm going to be walking you guys through how to make a matchup chart, and we're going to be using myself as an example, and we're going to be looking at how to analyze the matchups and how to just construct the chart in case you want to do that for yourself as well. So, yep, that's what we're going to be doing today. So let's just jump into the meat and potatoes of that. So, how to pick a tournament deck. So basically, I think there are two steps here. Step one, we're going to analyze the current metagame. So currently, today is August 17th, 2022. It's a couple days before the calling in Singapore and about a week before the Pro Tour 2. And given the RTN data, as well as the last couple major battle hardens, we are currently in a pretty diverse and fair metagame with no clear tier 0, tier 0.5 deck. In the past, we had Chain, and then we had Briar, and then we had Starvo, but currently there's really no hero that is jumping out at anybody as far and away the best deck. And so with that, that creates actually very interesting trends in terms of sideboard. So in the past, during the Chain meta, you would have to include certain sideboard cards if you wanted to have a decent matchup against them, like Snag was a popular choice. And then when Starvo came around, you basically needed a decent amount of defense reactions, because without those, you would get your hand ripped apart by Oaken Old or Crippling Crush, especially if you didn't have armor. So due to those things, there were some constraints on sideboard. In the current metagame, there aren't really any, because there's no front runner deck. People have had to diversify their sideboards. So, and we're seeing a trend towards less defense reactions just in general, because the Warrior and Guardian are not overwhelmingly popular at the moment. In addition to looking at the metagame, we also need to understand what we consider default or traditional deck configurations. So currently, what does a Viserai deck look like? Well, it's generally pretty aggressive and probably running Rainbow Mauvrin Skies. What does a typical Prism deck look like? Well, they're probably running 16 yellow auras and 12 yellow auras and probably 12 or 15 blue auras, in addition to having quite a few heralds as well, because they don't have to run as many heavy defense reactions, so they actually have room for heralds. What does a default Briar deck look like these days? Channel Mount Heroic with lots of zero cost stuff, decent amount of blue earth cards to support that. So just understanding the current configuration of decks in terms of their main board and their sideboard is actually very important, because that will help you. We're going to see in part 2 of this episode, when we go into making the matchup chart, that understanding what the default configuration of a deck is very important to understanding what your matchup score will be. Okay. I wrote here that understanding the general discourse and feelings of the metagame is important, so there's many ways you can do this. the FABtcg website has a lot of articles that talk about the recent results, and they also often have numbers there as well, so you can use that to get a general feeling of the metagame. There's also many people on YouTube that make videos like I do. So there's also, you can look on Facebook, Twitter, and Discord and all that. So just keeping up with what people are feeling and thinking about. You could talk with your teammates or with your locals as well. That is also very helpful. If you have people around the world, that can also be very, very useful, because oftentimes metagames can develop a little bit differently in different regions. So having, you know, a buddy or two internationally is also very helpful. So once we've analyzed the metagame, we can move on to making a matchup chart. So if you've been watching the TheCardGuyz YouTube channel religiously, then you know that recently we made a matchup chart for PT2, and we talked about the 6 most popular decks, and we made a whole video about an hour long discussing all of those matchups, as well as to their matchups into the general field, in terms of what we considered rare and what we considered mythic heroes. And then we used some math to figure out what we thought would be the highest expected value deck. If you haven't watched that, I highly recommend you go check that out. That's a very, very nice resource. But yeah, we're gonna go through and make a matchup chart right now, and we're gonna be using me as an example. So you're gonna get to have a sneak peek at what my thoughts are and how I pick a tournament deck. And we're just gonna jump into that right now. Let's not waste any time. All right, guys. So here is the matchup chart that the TheCardGuyz made last time. As you can see, we have the 6 heroes that we thought would comprise the majority of the metagame. And for each one, we developed a expected value here. So this basically is how many games we expect them to win out of 10. This is something that, if you're familiar with fighting games, this type of chart should look very familiar to you. So in this case, the column E here, this is the deck that we're talking about, and then row 5, these are the opponents. So we think Phi against Briar is roughly a 5-5, so 50-50. But we think Phi against Viserai is 45-55, so Phi has a 45% chance to win, whereas Viserai has a 55% chance to win. That's why there's a 5.5 here, right? So everything is mirrored here, right? So if there's a 3 here, there's a 7 here, right? So given the predicted share of the metagame and each of these individual scores, we can come up with an adjusted score, which is, so 4.7, this translates roughly to 47%, right? So at the very end of that video, Nathan talked about how you could make a personal matchup chart to help you guys pick a deck. So we're going to be going through that right now for myself, basically. All right, let's take a look at that. All right, so for me, as a warrior aficionado, I basically have 3 choices that I feel comfortable with bringing to Pro Tour 2. I could bring Dawnblade Dorinthia. This is the classic attack reaction focused Dorinthia with a couple of sideboard slots allocated to CNC and a raised face. A little bit more front pump heavy, running some things like plow through and stuff like that, just to help with the Guardian matchups there as well. And yeah, that's just a deck that's I'm pretty familiar with, been playing for a while. So that's option number 1 for me. Option number 2 for me is the Combo Bolton deck. So this would be the Centauri Sabers Lumina Ascension combo. And this would be a deck that is not running Raiden. So Switch Bolton is the deck that can switch between Raiden or Sabers based on the matchup. As you can see, most of my matchups are actually with Sabers. However, against Prism, Oldhim, Lexi, and Icelander, I would choose to play Raiden. Not because I want to play Raiden, but because the Switch Bolton deck does not have potions. So you're basically forced to play Raiden against some of the decks. So yeah, those are the 3 decks that I have right now. All right. As you can see, I've listed every single hero in Classic Constructed here. There's 17 heroes here. Okay. Up here, I have my predicted PT2 metagame share. Obviously, this will differ for you. You may not agree with me. In fact, my teammates don't agree with me for this. But yeah, so let me talk a little bit about why I think this is the metagame share in Lille. So first of all, I think if we add up the aggro decks here, that you can see this is 45%. I think the aggro decks are going to be about 40 to 50%. And I think because Viserai is considered a bit more stable, and Phi has some historically has been very popular and very strong. Even with the Stubbies banned, I still think there's going to be quite a bit of Phi. So I think those 2 decks are going to be a bit more represented than Briar. Briar is a little bit higher variance, in my opinion, compared to Viserai. So yeah, so that's why I think those 3 decks will be pretty popular. Prism at Pro Tour 1 was about 15-16%. I don't really see people switching off of her, and I don't really see people jumping on her either, because certain decks attract a very, very hardcore following. And Prism is one of those decks that if you're not on Prism already, like, you've had a year now to get on the Prism train, and, you know, hold foil out your deck and all that. But if you haven't done that yet, because there's actually quite a bit of aggro, I don't actually think Prism really wants to run into a meta where 45% of the decks are aggro. Although Prism obviously has a very, very nice matchup against the Guardians. In fact, probably at least 8.2, maybe even 8.5. But yeah, so that's why I think Prism will be about 16%. Bravo, this is a deck that is generally pretty good into the aggro decks. Obviously, we'll struggle with Prism, but it's a pretty stable deck overall, and I think a portion of the Starvo players are going to migrate to Bravo. As for Oldhim was about 5-6% at PT1. I don't really see a reason for him to have increased in PT2, especially given how soft he is to Prism. And even like, if you pilot these aggro decks very well and you understand how your deck interacts with Oldhim, I also think those matchups aren't too bad either. So I think Oldhim will hover about 5%. So yeah, as you can see here, like, these decks here comprise 73%. I think, especially in the winners meta game, a majority of your opponents are going to be over here, right? And there's quite a bit of a drop off between Briar and Oldhim. Dash, Lexi, Dromai, Dorinthia, I just think we've seen from our TN season that these decks are a medium popularity. I don't know if you can consider this medium popularity, but they're kind of in the middle here, so I guess it's medium. The people that like to play Dash, Lexi, Dromai, and Dorinthia are pretty faithful to their decks, even though these are not considered, you know, the strongest decks right now. I think a decent portion of the player base will show up with these decks. then down here, we have a pretty significant drop-off. Icelander and Kano, I don't expect to be pretty high. Oasis Respite is pretty strong against these decks, and like Icelander is also a deck that people haven't really figured out yet. So unless there's a really, really good showing for the Wizards at the Singapore Calling, I don't expect their meta share to be higher than 4% together. And then down here, we have Reinhardt, Bolton, Katsu, and Azalea. These heroes obviously are going to be very, very rare. I will probably be part of this 1% of Bolton. But yeah, so these heroes just are not popular. And they're not that very strong either. And they require quite a bit of dedication to the hero to even play it at a reasonable level. All right. So when you make your matchup chart, the very first thing you need to do is, list out all the heroes here, and then put in your predicted metagame share. Okay. Then you can list out the decks that you think have a shot, right? And then for each individual matchup, you're gonna put a number 0 to 10 for how many games you think you'd win against a similar level of opponent, or whatever level of opponent you're going to play in the tournament, right? So for me, it's going to be, how do I think I'm going to play against average PT2 level opponents, right? Okay, so over here, this is just for color coding. If I think a favorable matchup is above 5.5, 4.5 to 5.5, 45 to 55%, that's a neutral matchup, and anything less than 45% is an unfavorable matchup, right? So let's just run through each of these decks. So Dawnblade Dorinthia. Overall, I'd say against the aggro decks has a decent matchup, and the trend for none of these decks to run defense reactions is gonna allow you to really, really punish them, especially once you get their armor. So I think those three matchups are pretty stable. Obviously, the Prism matchup is atrocious, and I can't wait for her to be gone. Sorry, Prism mains. But yeah, you've kept the format for quite a while. And the reason for this is you don't have a lot of poppers, and you have no way to deal with ALS efficiently. You have no way to deal with the aura presence very efficiently. So you got to get quite lucky to even have a chance here. All right. Against Bravo, this is pretty much a 50-50 matchup. This is one of the most interesting matchups in the game, actually, for Dorinthia, because it's a very, very back and forth. It really, really... the game can go quite long, and you get to play different stages of the game, which is nice. Obviously, the matchup against Oldhim is pretty bad. Crown of Seeds plus Rampart of the Ram's Head is very, very efficient. So that's definitely an uphill battle. Yeah. So I don't want to go into each of these matchups because that's going to take forever. But just a couple notes here is that in the other chart, we listed all the mirrors as 5-5 matchups. Obviously, your mirror matchup may not be 5-5. As you can see here, I feel very, very confident in the mirror. And even in my Bolton mirrors, I think I have a slight advantage, because if I run into a Raiden Bolton as favors Bolton, I think I have an advantage there. So that's why this is above 5.5, and I feel strong in the mirror. That's why this is above 5.5, right? So yeah, just in general, the Wizards are a little bit difficult for Dorinthia. Kano can kill you out of nowhere. And Icelander is just pretty difficult to deal with. But yeah. Anyways, so given the predicted metagame share and each individual matchup, we have an adjusted score, right? Okay, you can see the formula here is basically taking 17% times 6 plus 16% times 1.5 and adding it up, right? So we get 5.02. So this means against this distribution of heroes, given these matchup scores, I expect to win 50.2% of my games, right? Let's briefly talk about Bolton here. So obviously, every single time I go Sabers, there's no difference between the matchups. I think literally it's the exact same deck, so there's no difference between those. And into the traditional aggro decks, Viscera and Briar have a decent amount of armor. They also have some high roll potential, so those are a little bit harder. Buy and high roll you, but I think generally you get to the combo as Bolton just in time, and in general, Ninja has a very difficult time blocking, so I think that's quite favorable. We'll go over the Raiden matchups later. Dash and Dromai. Dash really isn't doing anything to disrupt you. So if you can defend properly and not lose to max velocity or double high octane or something, you should be fine against Dash. Dromai again just doesn't disrupt your plan, and Dromai has several steps that they have to take to set up their board, so that gives you plenty of time. Dorinthia has quite a bit of armor and no attack actions, so that's a little bit tricky. But yeah, overall, the other matchups I think are okay. So as you can see, I have 4 Raiden matchups here. I feel like the matchup against Prism improves when you use Raiden because you have a way to deal with their board. In fact, Raiden might be the most efficient aura clearing tool in the game. So yeah, I think you get a boost in that matchup. You also boost your Icelander matchup slightly. I think I think this is probably this is the worst matchup in my spread here. Hypothermia is just shuts down your combo. So if you play Raiden against Icelander, you also don't have that many blues. And your resource curve is very tight, so I don't even think you get much of a boost, but you do get some boost, right? So you get a boost against Prism, get a boost against Icelander, but your matchups into Ultim and Lexi suffer because you don't have potions, and that means you're forced to play Raiden against these decks, and that's really not where you want to be. Playing Raiden into ice decks is not where you want to be. But I think actually your matchups get worse here, right? So 2 matchups get better, 2 matchups get worse. So overall, they're about neck and neck here, right? So again, you can make this own matchup chart for yourself, predict the metagame using the stuff we talked about in part 1, list out your decks that you think you feel comfortable playing. Even decks that you don't feel comfortable playing, you can still list them out, because let's say I have a 4th deck here and I'm not so familiar with them, I would just put lower scores in these matchups, right? So yeah. Let's go to the wrap up. All right, guys. Let's just go through some key takeaways and we'll wrap this episode up. So, understanding the general state of the metagame is very important to pick your deck. Like I said before, you need to understand the constraints of the metagame. Is there a popular tier 0 deck or a 0.5 deck? What does the current metagame share look like given the recent results as well as the general discourse on social media and Discord and, talking with your buddies? In addition to that, you need to understand how your deck interacts with the metagame. So knowing the default configurations of the deck is very important. Knowing what popular sideboard cards look like, what popular sideboards look for the popular decks is also very important. Are they a deck that typically runs CNC in their sideboard? Is it a deck that runs Oasis Respite, etc.? There's the best way to do that is just to look at the deck lists that have topped tournaments. If you have time, go through those, and just if you have a buddy or two that plays one of those popular decks, just have a chit chat with them. That'll also help a lot. Given that we're currently in a fair format, I believe that your practice and reps and familiarity with the deck is actually more important than just the raw strength of the deck. There's no deck right now that can carry a average player to a top 8 at the moment, right? In the past, I think there was a giant benefit to playing Chain, Briar, and Starvo, but currently, I think you should just pick the deck that you feel most comfortable with at the moment. And that comes down to the last point here, know thyself. This is how I like to summarize Sun Tzu's quote about knowing your enemy and knowing yourself. And if you do that, you'll win 100% of your battles. I talk about that in episode 8 and 9 of Fab 201, called The Art of War, Part 1, Art of War, Part 2. If you haven't seen those, go check those out. Those are pretty nice, and I think those might help you to prepare for upcoming tournaments. Speaking of upcoming tournaments, I will be flying out to Lille pretty soon. I should arrive in France on Monday or Tuesday. So yeah, if you're in town looking for some drafts, hit me up on Twitter or on Discord or whatever, and we'll arrange that. But yeah, if you're going to PT Lille or just going to Lille in general, I hope to see you guys there. If you're a fan of the channel, fan of the Card Guys, come up to sit and say hi to any of us. We'd be glad to chat with you guys. So yeah, that wraps up episode number 11 of Fab 201. I hope you're having a good day. Take care. See ya.